Hello, listeners, and welcome to Fighting Failure, the podcast where we discuss solutions to the climate crisis. This is episode 23, a minisode about how you can save energy in your home, and the last episode of the energy section of season 2 of Fighting Failure. I'm your host for this episode, Oscar Archibald, and I have brought back on very special guest, John Lucas, to talk to us about electricity. He is studying electrical and electronic engineering at university, so he should be well equipped to tell us about how we can save energy in our homes. John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm John Lucas. Very pleased to be here, and I love talking about LEDs.
Yes, and I don't know if you necessarily hold a very positive view. We've had a lot of conversations about sodium street lamps, for one. But in terms of electricity in a home, I think LEDs are one of the biggest ways to save energy because they use much less electricity than any other type of lamp. So would you like to talk to us a bit about how LEDs work and how much energy they can save?
So LED stands for light emitting diode, and what they are is a semiconductor-based lighting technology. So a semiconductor, broadly speaking, is a material that can exhibit the properties of both an electrical insulator and conductor, depending on its context, and a diode certainly falls into that category. And light-emitting diodes are a type where, when you pass current through them in one direction, they produce light. And the important thing about light-emitting diodes is that the way by which they produce this light is very efficient. So whereas a conventional filament lamp heats up a thin metal wire and makes it glow white hot, which obviously involves a lot of wasted heat in getting it to that white hot temperature, LEDs don't do that. They just have this semiconductor junction inside them, and as the current moves across from one side of the diode to the other, that produces a light output as the electrons move from one side to the other, and that's fundamentally how they work. It's also worth noting that LEDs run off low voltage direct current, so more like what comes out of a battery, whereas filament lamps can be just run directly off high voltage mains alternating current. So obviously if you're running LEDs off the mains, you've got to have something to convert the high voltage AC to low voltage DC for the LEDs.
Mm-hmm. So if I put LEDs in my roof, which I think it is LEDs, it's got like lots of sort of small things arranged around a plate. Does that mean that actually like above each LED socket, there's a small transformer and voltage downer? What's the name for that?
Voltage converter, step down voltage converter. Well, it's ultimately a step-down voltage converter and a rectifier, although all in one place. Now, as to where they're physically situated, that's an interesting question, because if your lights are quite new, which I would imagine they probably are, but then what you have is in the ceiling itself, or what's visible, is a little round section of LEDs on a flat panel, essentially. Lots of LED semiconductors in a combination of series and parallel wiring poking through the hole in the ceiling with a sort of frosted cover over them, and then in the void above the ceiling, above the drywall, you then have what's called an LED driver, and that takes in your high voltage mains. It has what is essentially a step down transformer inside it to step the voltage down to a level which can safely operate the low voltage LEDs, and then also a rectifier which converts it to DC, because LEDs only work with current in one direction. So that's the most modern way of doing things. However, in a lot of cases with domestic lighting, you're working with light fittings that are designed around conventional incandescent bulbs. So continuing to take your example of downlights in ceilings, even though modern ones are generally sort of built with LEDs right from the start, you can get so-called retrofit LED bulbs, and that's just like a conventional incandescent globe-shaped bulb or an incandescent halogen lamp, the little reflector lamps. And instead of having a filament inside it, what it's got all in that enclosure is the voltage step-down converter, rectifier, and also the LED semiconductors, all enclosed in that one body. And that means that you can connect it to a fitting, light fitting, which is just powered directly from the mains, and then it deals with all the voltage conversion and everything inside it, so it's a direct swap.
That's really interesting, because I was actually thinking about those sort of bulbs that you can fit into, because the ones I've got in my roof, they're like fit into the roof. And there was actually, when I was very little, I remember I was in bed and like one of those things just fell out on the roof and just fell onto me, and I got slightly burnt. Like, I was fine, but it was a bit hot. And I was thinking maybe LEDs do get a little hot, right? But nothing compared to the heat wastage of an incandescent or halogen bulb. But yeah, that's interesting that they fit like all those components inside of the thing that can still fit into an ordinary light socket. Like, if you have a lamp hanging down from the ceiling, you could buy a really cheap energy saving bulb from the supermarket. You can probably get it at a Tesco and just replace that, and it'll save you a bunch of money on your energy bill.
You can. They're not cheap up front, but they pay for themselves very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing with any sort of energy saving solution, is that if you have a smart meter and you pay for how much electricity you use, then you can save a lot of money on your energy bill by swapping out for energy saving bulbs.
Yes. And I think a lot of people still have this overhanging impression with energy-saving bulbs that they're dim and they require a long time to start up. I don't know if you've witnessed that, but the very old energy-saving bulbs were actually little fluorescent tubes curled into a spiral.
Yeah, because I remember someone telling me that, I've heard somewhere that, energy-saving bulbs are only worth it if you turn it on and leave it on for so long or something.
That's very true for old energy-saving bulbs, which were a fluorescent tube, because they they'd basically fail much more prematurely if you were turning them on and off a lot, so like in a bathroom or something where they didn't stay on for long.
Oh, that's really interesting. I never knew about that sort of stuff behind it. That's a fluorescent tube curled up. Because fluorescent tubes, for people who aren't necessarily aware, those like really long ones that you generally have on the roof of a classroom or office building or something like that.
In terms of mentioning fluorescent tubes, that's another example of where LEDs can be made to fit in a form factor for an old-fashioned fitting. So you can now get these so-called retrofit fluorescent tubes, and all they are is LEDs crammed into a long tube-shaped enclosure, which you can then put in your ceiling in place of a fluorescent tube. Now, whether or not that's worth it, I think we'll be discussing in a moment, but the technology is there and does exist, and I've seen a lot of places, particularly schools, go down that route. Now, I personally don't think that's a very good route to take, and I'll explain why later.
Yeah, in fact, I think we've covered like the advantages of LEDs. Would you like to, because I know you personally have reasons that you don't necessarily like LEDs. Would you like to explain that basically now?
In the home, and compared with incandescent lamps, which is, broadly speaking, in domestic contexts, people are moving from incandescent lamps to LEDs. The difference in efficiency is very pronounced. So for the same light output, in terms of the same brightness, you could be going from a 100-watt incandescent bulb to, let's say, a 12-watt LED bulb. So that's nearly 10 times more efficient. And so that's a massive improvement in efficiency, and a well-made LED retrofit bulb, like what most people are going to be installing if it's not a new build property, a well-made LED bulb should last 20 years, no problem. Unfortunately, and this is the first element of the problems with LEDs, is that the light bulb manufacturers broadly seem to be playing on people's expectations that light bulbs will burn out every few months. And basically, the quality of LED bulbs is generally, if you're not careful, it's generally not what it should be. That means that they fail prematurely. Now, if you choose good brands of LED bulb, then the premature failures are much less likely. However, obviously, if you're getting bulbs which fail prematurely because the LEDs, let's say, don't have enough enough of a heat sink on the back, because they do produce a low level of heat which needs to be dealt with, otherwise they burn themselves up. If you're getting bulbs that don't have that and they're failing, then that's a lot of electronic waste that then has to be dealt with. And if you're having to replace bulbs with that frequency and then disposing of them, it becomes more viable in terms of the disposal of an incandescent bulb, which is not hazardous or electronic waste. That can be handled a lot more carefully. So it's counterproductive to have LED bulbs which fail all the time, not to mention the fact that they're more expensive, so they end up, the payoff period is a lot longer. So however, if you choose good LED bulbs for the home, then that's always a very good investment. Where the difference is less pronounced, I researched this quite a bit for my sixth form studies about LEDs, is when generally in corporate or outdoor environments. And now corporate environments are typically lit by fluorescent tubes, as you mentioned, for classrooms as an example, but offices, classrooms, some factories are lit by fluorescent tubes, and outdoor environments are traditionally lit by sodium lamps, and they're the classic sort of orangey yellow nighttime city colour. Most people are probably familiar with that. So in terms of fluorescent tubes and sodium lamps also for that matter, the difference in efficiency between fluorescent tubes and LEDs, or sodium lamps and LEDs, is much less pronounced than it would be going from incandescent lamps to LEDs. So the financial saving and environmental saving is a lot lower. And then once you take into account the hassle of having to install retrofit fluorescent tubes in a fluorescent fitting, many of which, incidentally, it's not just a direct swap into the fluorescent fitting. You actually have to get an electrician to rewire the light fitting itself to accommodate an LED fluorescent tube. After you're taking that into account, the benefits are often not so attractive. And in the case of fluorescent tubes, nearly all LED retrofit fluorescent tubes tend to be dimmer than the original fluorescent tubes they would have replaced. So people don't like that, because obviously dim lighting is it's not easy to work under dim lighting, and also the reason why they're dimmer is because having all the LEDs bunched together in a tube-shaped enclosure, which has to be the same shape as a sort of thin, slender fluorescent tube, having them in that form factor does not lend itself to dissipating heat well. So even though LEDs are efficient, they produce a little bit of heat, and that has to be dealt with properly in the form of good heat sinks, high surface area. Otherwise, they will burn themselves out, and retrofit fluorescent tubes, being a tube-shaped enclosure, can't really accomplish that. So premature failures are common, and I remember at school when they made a wholesale replacement to LED retrofit tubes, more or less, I think probably once a month, there will be some new failure of an LED tube, and given the amount of hassle they would have had to go to replace the tubes at that point, if they were and this is applicable in any scenario, at that point, if you're wanting to upgrade your fluorescent fittings to LED, you just have to bite the bullet and replace the whole fitting with a dedicated LED fitting, and that's from the ground up. You have the LEDs mounted in a proper flat, wide configuration with plenty of heatsink space, and then the new fitting goes on your ceiling. And now obviously that is more intrusive to install, and once again you get back to the point that the difference in efficiency between fluorescent and LED lighting is less pronounced. So to do it properly in terms of upgrading to LEDs from fluorescent tubes, it's quite a bit harder, And for that reason, in many cases, keeping fluorescent tubes is quite a bit more preferable. Now, this is sort of partly my personal view, but I know it's a view that I share with various other engineering friends. And I think it's quite telling, actually, that here at the university, the electrical engineering building hasn't replaced its fluorescent tubes with retrofit LED ones, presumably because they know about the caveats. And then much the same applies with sodium lamps, I ought to say.
Okay, that's all very interesting. One thing that I picked up on especially was that thing about like the light bulb conspiracy, where light bulb makers actually deliberately shorten the lifespan of their products, especially because consumers just don't realize that things could last for so much longer. I'm sure I've watched a few videos about this. Like there's a incandescent bulb in a fire station that's been on for like 100 years or something like that. But because the consumer doesn't have an idea of how long these things could potentially last, it means that companies are able to rip them off. And planned obsolescence is definitely something we're going to be talking about in a future episode as well.
Yes, because I think particularly it's sort of come back to the forefront now that we've got a lighting technology which could potentially last essentially forever. However, the manufacturers that are making it are coming from the approach where they've been historically making products that would have a sort of cyclic lifespan in terms of people returning to buy them. So their business models are rather rigidly fixed around that, and that's why they don't last as long as they should. And so obviously that gives LEDs rather a bad name.
Totally. Okay, so moving on from LEDs, are there any other like simple swaps that could be made in a home that can reduce energy usage? Or also, if you're buying a new appliance, what should you look for to make sure you're saving as much energy as possible?
So for buying a new appliance, these days most appliances, I think with the notable exception of vacuum cleaners, I was reading, have an EU energy rating. It goes, I believe, from A to G. The old one went from something like A+++ to F, I think. The reason for all those pluses was because appliances kept getting more and more efficient, so they had to keep adding boundaries, a bit like grade inflation, I suppose. But I think now it goes from A to more or less G, and obviously the higher the better in terms of an appliance's classification. So, for example, a washing machine is a good example. In many cases, a more efficient appliance will be that bit more expensive. However, that difference in price between a more efficient and a less efficient appliance will almost always end up paying for itself in the long term. And it's also worth noting that appliances where the manufacturer has gotten to the effort of making them more efficient will probably be just better built all in all, and therefore will require lower maintenance and lower running costs over time. So it should be, the price of an appliance should be viewed holistically, broadly speaking. And on the note of vacuum cleaners, because they don't have energy labels anymore, I believe that was James Dyson. He won a court case about it because of, and that was legitimate because the way they were measuring the efficiency of vacuum cleaners wasn't representative of how they were used in the real world. But basically, there's been a long-running situation with vacuum cleaners where the manufacturers make the wattage higher and higher just so they can say, oh, look at our vacuum cleaner, it's 2,000 watts, this is better than the 1,000 watt one. That's now been tamed down a bit by EU regulations. However, fundamentally at this stage, a 1,000 watt vacuum cleaner of a modern high efficient standard can easily be as efficient as a 2,000 watt vacuum cleaner from 20 years ago. So that it's important to break out of this idea that fewer watts equals worse performance. And I know I've seen a lot of sort of scaremongering newspaper articles about the EU wattage restriction on vacuum cleaners. Oh, my house is going to be filthy. Oh, it's going to be full of pet hair. It's not true, and the in many cases, so I think in all cases, the manufacturers of vacuum cleaners have made them suitably more efficient, so that there's no noticeable impact on performance.
Sounds good. And in terms of a fridge, if I remember a podcast I listened to correctly, unless your fridge is really, really old, it probably won't pay it won't pay for itself to replace a fridge. If your fridge is broken and you're getting a new one, and that's the same for any of these appliances, unless your appliance is really old and inefficient, it probably won't pay to replace it. But if you need to replace the appliance for other reasons, it's totally worth paying a bit extra for a more efficient model. Is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up, John?
That's absolutely true, and particularly fridges. The technology hasn't really changed a lot ultimately, and they were already quite efficient to start with broadly, unless you're going really far back in time. And just there's not much that has changed. Probably the only difference would be that newer models are marginally better insulated. But that's about it. So in terms of sort of domestic appliances and energy saving, that it's certainly important to pay marginally more for a better appliance.
Yeah, because a fridge is actually just a heat pump, just sort of the other way around, or it's moving the heat it's heating up your home basically by taking the heat away from your food that you put in the fridge. And like if you listened to episode 19, you would have heard the technology in heat pumps hasn't really advanced much recently because the efficiency savings happened many, many years ago. Yeah. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much for coming on the show today.
That's fine. Greatly enjoyed it.
And hopefully we'll see you back in the future someday.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Goodbye.
Bye.